The summer she turned 11, a girl in Franklin County, Missouri, started collecting things other farmers set fire to. Every Saturday morning, she pulled a red wagon down the county road with a dog trotting behind her. She stopped at each farm where the burn piles were highest, cornstalks heaped after harvest, apple branches from the spring pruning, dead brush cleared from fence lines. She asked if she could take them. The neighbors said yes, the way you say yes to a child who wants something worthless. They were going to burn it anyway. She loaded the wagon and pulled it home. The pile beside the east fence grew taller each week, cornstalks and branches and brush stacked waist high, then shoulder high, drying in the autumn air. The neighbors saw her do it. The truck drivers on Route F saw her do it. Mr. Jessup, 3 farms east, stood at his fence one afternoon and watched her drag a bundle of his own cornstalks across the road. He shook his head not unkindly, the way you shake your head at something you cannot explain. "That girl's collecting our burn pile," he told his wife that evening. "Lord knows what she thinks charcoal's going to do." She did not explain when her father asked. She said she needed them. When Mr. Jessup asked, she said the same thing. She did not say what for, she just kept pulling the wagon. Nobody on that road knew what she planned to do with a pile of dead cornstalks. By the end of the following summer, they were standing in her garden trying to understand if stories of children who see what adults overlook. Soil that remembers what science forgot, and the kind of patience that grows things from ashes means something to you. Subscribe and stay with us. Tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. The Pruitt family had farmed 12 acres in Franklin County for as long as anyone on the road could remember. It was not a large operation. It was the kind of farm that existed between ambition and stubbornness, too small to make a man rich, too rooted to let him leave. The land sat in the Missouri River Valley where the soil had once been dark and loose and generous. The kind of ground that held the shape of your boot print after rain and smelled like something alive when you turned it in April. That was a long time ago. 30 years of synthetic fertilizer and continuous corn had changed the equation. The organic matter, the living layer that makes soil breathe, had dropped below 1.5%. The ground was gray now, tight. When it rained, the water pooled on the surface and ran off instead of soaking in, carrying topsoil with it in brown ribbons down the slope toward the creek. When it didn't rain, the surface baked into a crust you could tap with your knuckle and hear it click. The garden was the worst of it. A quarter acre behind the house where the girl's grandmother had once grown tomatoes and green beans, enough for every family on the road. The grandmother was gone, now past 2 winters back, but the garden remained. Producing less each year, the plants smaller, the leaves yellowing earlier, the fruit not quite right in ways that were hard to name but easy to taste. The girl's father managed the corn and soybeans on the remaining acres. He bought fertilizer each spring and watched his costs rise and his yields flatten and said little about either. The girl was not like her father. She was not like most 11-year-olds on that road. She read more than she spoke. She spent her Saturdays at the county library in a back corner marked Soil Science, where the books had dust thicker than their covers and the checkout cards showed stamps no more recent than the late 1980s. Her grandmother had told her once sitting in the garden on an evening when the tomatoes were still worth eating that the ground talks, but most people don't sit still long enough to listen. The girl sat still. She listened, and one afternoon in that library corner, she found something that changed what she heard. The book was old and smelled like basements. The last stamp on the checkout card said 1987. Nobody had opened it in almost 20 years. It was a soil science text, and most of it was too dense for an 11-year-old. But one chapter had pictures. The chapter described something called Terra Preta de Indio, the black earth of the Indians, a type of soil found deep in the Amazon basin that had puzzled scientists for decades. In a region where the natural soil was thin and acidic and could barely support crops, there were patches of earth so dark and fertile that anything planted in them grew as if the ground itself were feeding it. The patches were hundreds of years old. Some were over 2,000. The people who made them were gone, but what they left behind told the story. They had taken agricultural waste crop residue, fallen branches, food scraps, and burned it in pits with very little oxygen, not burned the way her neighbors burned their piles, with open flame and thick smoke that ate everything to ash. Burned slowly, smothered, starved of air, what remained was not ash. It was something else entirely. The book called it biochar, a form of carbon so porous that a single gram held the surface area of a tennis court. When buried in soil, it did not decompose. It stayed for hundreds of years, holding water in its hollow structure, like a sponge made of carbon, trapping nutrients that would otherwise wash away, and creating a home for the fungi and bacteria that make soil alive. The book had a diagram, a shallow pit, organic waste layered inside, a cover of dirt with a small vent for smoke. Temperature between 300 and 700 degrees. Very little flame, very little smell. The product, when cooled, tinkled like broken glass when poured light black. And full of air. There was one more detail the girl underlined in pencil. Biochar alone was not enough. Mixed straight into soil, it would pull nutrients from the ground before giving anything back. It needed to be charged first, soaked in compost for 2 weeks, letting the porous structure fill with microbial life and nutrients. Biochar plus compost, not one or the other. Both. She closed the book. She looked at the checkout card. 1987. Nearly 20 years, and no one had read what she had just read. The answer had been sitting on that shelf the entire time. Waiting for someone who sat still long enough to find it, she went home and looked at the pile of cornstalks beside the east fence. She saw them differently now. She dug it behind the garden on a Saturday morning, 2 feet deep. 3 feet across. She layered cornstalks and apple branches inside, lit the pile and covered it with dirt the way the diagram showed. But she did not pack the cover tightly enough. Air crept in through the cracks, the fire burned hot and open, and by evening what remained was a pit of pale gray ash, light, powdery, gone when the wind picked up. No structure. No hollow carbon, no tinkle when poured. Just dust. She sat beside the pit for a while. Then she went inside, opened the book, and read the chapter on oxygen control again. The second pit was better. She packed the dirt cover thick, sealed the edges with wet clay from the creek bank, and left only a vent the width of 2 fingers. The fire burned low and slow, almost no smoke. When she uncovered it the next morning, the material inside was black and light and crumbled into porous chunks that made a faint glass sound when she poured them into a bucket. Biochar. She mixed it straight into the garden that afternoon. 2 weeks later, the tomato plants closest to the biochar turned yellow and wilted. Her father looked at them across the garden fence and said what he had been thinking since the first pit. Told you. Charcoal doesn't grow tomatoes. He was right, technically. She had skipped the charging step. Uncharged biochar pulls nutrients from soil before it gives anything back. The book had said so, and she had been too eager to wait. She composted the next batch for 2 weeks in a bucket behind the shed. Biochar, soaked in kitchen scraps and chicken manure, the porous structure filling with microbial life. When she worked the charged biochar into the soil in late October, the tomato bed did not complain. By November, worm castings appeared on the surface for the first time in years. She wrote it down in pencil in a notebook she kept under her bed. She did not tell anyone. "She's making a mess in that garden," Mrs. Morrison said to Mr. Jessup at the co-op one morning, not unkindly. "Charcoal and compost. That's not farming, that's campfire leftovers." July came in dry and did not leave. 3 weeks without rain. Missouri summers are humid enough to make you believe moisture is everywhere, but humidity is not water, and the soil knew the difference. Across Franklin County, gardens that had been watered and fertilized and tended with 30 years of conventional knowledge began to fail. Mr. Jessup lost his tomatoes first, 200 plants, better boys and early girls. The hybrids the co-op recommended every spring. The leaves curled inward, then yellowed, then crisped at the edges like paper held too close to a flame. He watered twice a day. The water sat on the surface of his compacted soil and ran sideways into the row furrows, pooling in places that did no good and evaporating before it reached the roots by the 3rd week. The fruit was dropping green. Mrs. Morrison's green beans went next, the vines browned from the base upward, the roots groping through tight gray soil that held nothing. She ran the hose until the well pump labored. The water hit the ground and beaded on the crust like rain on a parking lot. Across the county, the pattern repeated. Conventional soil tilled annually, stripped of organic matter. Dependent on synthetic inputs, had no structure left to hold moisture. Water passed through or ran off. The ground was not soil anymore, it was substrate. The girl's quarter-acre was different. 8 months earlier, she had buried charged biochar in every bed, the black porous carbon mixed with compost that she had made from cornstalks her neighbors gave away for free. The biochar sat in the soil like a million tiny reservoirs, each pore holding water from the spring rains that had long since stopped falling. The soil was dark and cool 3 inches down when everything around it was pale and hot. Her tomatoes, big boy Roma cherry held, green leaves and red fruit in a garden surrounded by brown. One afternoon, Mr. Jessup stood at the fence between his property and the Pruitt place. He looked at his tomato rows, bare stalks, dropped fruit, dry ground. Then he looked across at the girl's garden, green, full, alive. He stood there for a long time. He did not say anything. The next morning, he walked over. He did not knock on the door. He walked straight to the garden and stood at the edge of the tomato bed, looking at it the way you look at something that contradicts what you thought you knew. The girl was kneeling between the rows, pulling a weed that had found its way into soil, worth growing in. She looked up. She did not speak. She went back to weeding. Jessup walked the length of the garden without saying a word. He looked at the tomato leaves, thick, dark green, no curl. He looked at the bean trellis vines climbing, pods fat. He stopped at the far end, knelt down, and picked up a handful of soil. It was dark, almost black, and it held the shape of his hand for a moment, before crumbling apart slowly, the way healthy soil is supposed to break and hasn't in Franklin County for a long time. He could see the biochar in it, small black fragments, lighter than they looked. He could see the white threads of fungal mycelium lacing through the crumbles. He could see a worm. He stood up. He walked back to where the girl was kneeling. He looked at her, then at the pile of cornstalks still stacked beside the east fence, his cornstalks, from his field, that he had given her every Saturday for a year because they were worth nothing to him. He asked one question: "What did you put in this dirt?" She did not look up from the weed in her hand. They're cornstalks. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man rearranging what he thought he understood about soil and charcoal, and the girl who pulled a wagon past his farm every Saturday morning. He stood there a while longer. Then he said quietly, "You got any more of that?" That fall, 3 families in Franklin County stopped burning their crop waste. Nobody announced it. There was no meeting at the co-op. No flyer at the extension office. Jessup stacked his cornstalks instead of lighting them. Morrison asked the girl to show her how to dig the pit, how deep, how much cover, how small the vent. The girl's father, who had stood at the garden fence and said charcoal doesn't grow tomatoes, dug a pit at the far end of his cornfield one evening after supper. He did not mention it at breakfast the next morning. The county library reported 1 checkout from the soil science section that October. The book smelled the same. The stamp card had a new date. George Washington Carver once said, "I love to think of nature as an unlimited broadcasting station through which God speaks to us every hour if we will only tune in." A girl in Franklin County tuned in. She listened to a book that had been waiting since 1987, to cornstalks that had been waiting to become something other than smoke, and to soil that had been waiting for someone to give back what 30 years of farming had taken away. The answer was in the burn pile. It had been there for 2,000 years. All it needed was someone willing to sit in a library long enough to find it. The burn pile is smaller this year. The soil is darker, and the girl is still pulling her wagon on Saturdays. What is the one thing everyone around you throws away that might be worth keeping? Tell us in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe, and we will see you next week.